Hey guys, this is Kevin with Precision Powerlifting Systems. I'm going to do a video today that's going to kind of pick up from where we left off with the previous video. So in the previous video, I discussed frustration's role in developing skill. So one thing I want to say really quick about frustration is your brain doesn't know frustration as an emotion. So when you see a lifter like throw their wrist wraps, their belt, or get pissed off about something, texting their coach, complaining about how frustrated they are, that context that they're bringing to it is not what your brain views frustration as. Frustration to your brain is just a neurochemical landscape, and that neurochemical landscape actually sets things up for us to learn very well. So one of the roles of frustration, and in today's video we're going to discuss fear, which has a very similar neurochemical environment that it creates. It's to help us become aware, and it actually will increase our performance and our learning over time, because there's a survival benefit for us to actually be scared. So the role of fear is not necessarily to dissuade us from doing something. It's just to make us more aware, and it's to set up an environmental landscape so that we can learn from that fear to whether we need to run away, fight, collaborate, whatever it may be. There's a survival benefit to that fear. But it's there so that it can set this neurochemical landscape for us so that we can learn from it and we can move forward. We need this fear and frustration in order to develop high-level skill in anything. Now, the thing with fear is it can go one of two ways. There are plenty of lifters or athletes in general, who cope with fear very well, and they kind of lean into the fear, and there's almost an addictive piece to the fear itself. Like those neurochemicals that start making your heart race and all of that stuff, it's kind of addicting and you want that thrill, that adrenaline rush. And then there's others who get crippled by the fear. And as coaches, I think it's our job to give each athlete the tools that they need to understand that fear isn't to dissuade us from doing things, that it's actually setting us up to really learn something so that we can develop a high level skill, so that our technique can get better, so we can learn something. And these neurochemicals are actually responsible for our learning. So the first neurochemical that I want to discuss is norepinephrine. And I'm sorry if this is too far away, and if it is, feel free to message me and ask questions or whatever. So norepinephrine it's a stress hormone and a neurotransmitter. So this is part of our fight or flight response. And I know we always talk about the fight or flight as being one or the other. There's actually three things that happen with our stress response, or that can happen with the stress response. We either fight, we either flight, or we freeze. All right, and I think in a lot of cases you see that like deer in the headlights look on lifters when they get put into these situations, whether it's at a competition or whatever it may be. So where I started getting this thought process, or where I started kind of digging deeper into what was going on under these competitive circumstances. So if you go back a ways, you can hear me discuss how competing is actually a skill in and of itself. And it's because of that different psychological environment that a competition brings. So if you have to cut weight, wake up early that day, there's a lot of people around, you're typically in a gym setting or in a conference hall somewhere that you're not familiar with, there's a bunch of strangers there, so it can be very nerve-wracking for the individual, especially if they haven't competed many times. Plus the weights get heavy, and the weights are going to have their own psychological response to all of this as well. So I've always discussed how you need to learn how to compete in the gym, like that's going to be part of your training process. And I think in a lot of programs it's not. So one of the reasons why I like max effort lifts is because it creates a psychological arousal within the lifter, and it kind of teaches them to deal with their shit while we're in the gym. So you can get heavy enough weights, you can get an awkward enough movement that puts fear and frustration into the lifter and set that neurochemical backdrop up for success. Now when I say frustration, I'm not saying we should just load up the bar so that they fail something. That's not the point. Like I said, like your brain does not view frustration as an emotion. It's just a neurochemical landscape. And it's a neurochemical landscape that actually increases our ability to learn. Fear is the same thing. Fear is not to stop you from doing something. It's just to make you more aware, and it actually heightens some of our systems for greater performance. So we need to teach the lifters how to lean into the fear and to cope with it and not try to run from it. So I guess kind of we want to develop that fight, not the flight part, but it's one and the same. So one of the earlier conversations that I had with Keith Davids on Boston Strongcast, I also did another podcast with him more recently on the Philosophical Weightlifting podcast. I encourage everybody to check out both of those. But he had said to me that training needs to have consequences. Right, and at the time I understood that like that psychological component does change the performance of many lifters, because if they're not used to dealing with the psychological component, it's a change of those initial conditions that can have a major effect on our performance, right? It's one of those small initial condition changes that can have a large impact on our performance, especially if somebody can't cope with the fear. But if they can cope with the fear, that's where you often see, like during competition, somebody's just able to lift more weights than they can even in the gym, because they're kind of harnessing that fear and putting it into something more positive for them. And we're going to kind of discuss why that works. So the neurochemical I really want to discuss today with fear is norepinephrine. And I'm sorry if you can't read the board if it's too far away, but feel free to comment or reach out to me and just ask questions. So norepinephrine is a stress hormone and a neurotransmitter. So when we get that stress response, norepinephrine floods our system. All right, and this is really important to understand, because this norepinephrine, and I discussed this in the frustration video, starts the cascade of us learning new things. So norepinephrine comes in, acetylcholine follows norepinephrine, and acetylcholine is what gets that motor neuron response. And over time, from sleeping and repeating these bouts of effort, under these circumstances, that motor neuron response gets further ingrained, and that's how we develop long-term learning, that long-term skill, right? So I did a post where I was explaining the difference between performance and learning. Performance is those day-to-day changes. So if I go into the gym and I do a squat and I squat 500 pounds, right? I go into the gym the following week and I only get 480. I go in the following week and it's 515. So my numbers are kind of all over the place. That's my performance. But in terms of force output and technique, the learning are those long-term changes. So let's say one day my knees come in, the next day they don't, the next time my knees come in, but over time they stop coming in and I have a stable 500-pound squat. That's my learned behavior. My learned behavior is my knees are staying out in a 500-pound squat. Those are the long-term changes. The other aspects are just performance parameters. So our job as a coach is to set up the training environment as a learning environment for the lifter to perform in. So if we put them in certain positions, we use accommodating resistance, we pick volumes and intensities which elicit fatigue, we use heavier weights to get that psychological response, and over time they have frustration, they have fear, they have that dopamine response, so that reward from hitting a little 5-pound PR or doing something a little bit better. So we have all of these neurochemicals that come in that allow for us to perform, but also to learn over time. And so our job as a coach, like I was saying, is to set up a learning environment for the lifter to perform in, so that their learned behavior becomes what we're looking for: better technique, better force production, and all of those things. Part of setting up that environment is creating that psychological response. Now, you can't just go into the gym and train in a comfortable setting all of the time, because what happens, you have these levels of the nervous system, right? So we're just gonna, for really simplistic reasons, we have upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. The upper motor neurons only turn on when something catches our attention. So frustration, fear, they're gonna turn on those upper motor neurons. Our body's going to pay attention because there's a survival benefit to it. We need to know, is this something that we need to pay attention to so that we can fight or flight, and we can learn from it, so that if we have to collaborate later on, or whatever we need to do to be able to survive, pass our genes on, and do all of that stuff. So neurochemically, our body doesn't really understand the modern world. It just all it is neurochemistry and electricity, and we're just making our way through that world. And as a coach, you're setting up that athletic world for that lifter. And you have to have that emotional response, because that catches the upper motor neuron's attention. Now, if you don't have that emotional response in training, that frustration, that fear, what ends up happening is over time, our body's in this weird paradox where we're always trying to learn new things, but we also want to conserve energy and make things a lot more habitual and automatize these movements. So what happens over time is eventually, if there's no fear and frustration, the upper motor neurons are like, I don't need to pay attention to this anymore, and they pass it down to the lower levels to control it. Once it's passed down to the lower levels, it's become automatized. We conserve energy and you just kind of keep doing the same thing over and over. And you're really not going to develop newer behavior at that point. It's just basically a habit, unless you get some frustration and fear in there. So you put weight on too heavy that a lifter misses, or all of a sudden you put them in a variation that kind of catches their attention because their knees are caving in and they're falling forward on a squat or whatever it may be. You're now getting the upper motor neurons' attention again, and you're setting up that environment to actually learn a skill. But if we don't do that continuously enough, so even if you only did it one time a month, that's probably not enough to develop a higher level habit that it'll pass down later on. So you need to be doing it frequently enough to catch the upper motor neurons' attention, so that we can develop those higher levels of skill. And what that requires is it requires this norepinephrine right here. This sets the stage for the upper motor neurons to turn on and be like, hey, we better fucking pay attention here, or something bad might happen. Like, our survival is at risk. And when that happens, we're setting up literally an environment for us to learn. So norepinephrine, like I said, is a stress hormone and a neurotransmitter. So along with dopamine, norepinephrine is responsible for our attention and focus. So low levels of norepinephrine are actually found in patients with depression and ADD and ADHD. So one of the drugs that's utilized in depression and maybe ADD and ADHD too, I'd have to actually look this up, are serotonin, norepinephrine, reuptake inhibitors. So basically what it does is it stops the cells that release norepinephrine and serotonin, which is another transmitter that we'll talk about another day, not today. So the cells themselves that release norepinephrine will take back up unused norepinephrine. So what it does is it stops that reuptake process, so it floods the brain with more norepinephrine, so that it can be utilized with the receptors and get more of a response of what we want. So if it's taken up by cells within the brain itself, we should see an increase in attention and focus. And for the patients that tend to have good success on these medications, we see a drop in depression, or some of the byproducts of being depressed. So it increases attention and focus, which obviously, if you've listened to any of my videos and podcasts and follow me on Instagram, I talk a lot about how important attention and focus is. Well, this is one of the neurochemicals that's extremely important for attention and focus. Dopamine would be the other one. It also increases our heart rate. It increases our alertness. It increases our arousal. It increases our reaction time. So when you think of like high-level athletic performers, when you're seeing them in like the fourth quarter of a big game, right? So like somebody like Tom Brady, who has all those come from behind wins. That's somebody, when that stress kicks in, when their back's up against the wall and they get that fear and that frustration. And again, it doesn't mean their knees are shaking because they're so scared. Your brain doesn't understand the emotion of fear and frustration. It only knows this neurochemical response. And so what happens a lot of times is we have learned behavior. So once these neurotransmitters and these neurochemicals are released, we have this environment, this really good environment to learn something. What happens next is most likely going to become our learned behavior. So if we learn to run from the fear, that's always going to be our response. We're always going to be scared, and it's going to limit performance, right? So this is why, like, you'll hear like in sports psychology, they talk a lot about like managing fear and all of those things, right? This is really important. So if the game's on the line and you get nervous and scared and all of that stuff, and you get this neurochemical response, and your learned behavior is to not cope with it and lean into it, but to kind of run away from it or allow it to negatively affect you, that'll become your learned behavior. So that's your new habit. But if you learn how to cope with the fear and understand that it's literally your body's way of just saying like, hey, our back is up against the wall right now. We need to pay attention. We need to increase our reaction time, our arousal, our alertness. And if you lean into that and you understand that this is your body getting you primed to literally fight or flight for its survival, right? Think of how important that must be for your body. And it's setting up that environment for you to do those things. There is a lot of performance that could be had from leaning into that fear and frustration at that given point in time. So we want our learned behavior to be that adrenaline junkie, that when we get that fear, we lean into it and we almost want to seek it out and really search for that adrenaline rush within training itself, so that we can keep pushing our boundaries. Because when this happens, right, when we get that stress response and norepinephrine's coming in, what that's telling me as a coach or me as a lifter is it's telling me we are stepping outside of our comfort zone. We are putting ourselves in a position that we need to be put in to get better. And that's why it's so important to have your reasons of why you want to do this and your tools to be able to cope with those situations at that given point in time. So for me, I've been playing sports my entire life. Since the time I was 3-4 years old, I've participated in some type of high level, obviously not at 3 or 4, but as I developed into a teenager, I've been participating in high level sports almost my entire life since. So I've been forced to develop those tools just from my previous experiences of playing sports. Not everybody's developed these same traits over time. So there's things that we need to do with our lifters, and when we talk about specificity, we often talk about the movement or the weight and the force, but we kind of forget about the specificity of the psychological pieces, right? So if somebody's weakness is they're running from that fear all the time and they don't know how to lean in and cope with the fear, what we need to do is we need to put them in places, and even in their regular life, they can kind of take control of this. So let's say they're scared of public speaking. So maybe they find some friends and they're like, hey, one time a week, I'm going to give a talk for 5 minutes, right? They do something that kind of steps outside their comfort zone in a psychological setting. The backdrop for it's the exact same. Our ability to cope with the neurochemistry that's coming in and lean into it is the exact same, no matter what the circumstance is. Our brain doesn't really understand what's going on. It's stuck inside of our head. We bring context to those feelings based off of the situation we're in. But the feelings themselves are the same. They can start to help develop some of those skills to really lean in on that fear and to make use of that environment to really learn a high level skill. So we all know that it's important to step outside of your comfort zone in order to get stronger, right? I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But I think the problem is we view the comfort zone as maybe a volume and intensity thing, or if we do max effort all the time, we're stepping outside of our comfort zone because there'll be fear and frustration. But over time, you stop getting scared of those bigger weights, and it just becomes this habit of being able to just perform. And one of the things that my lifters have said to me, so it was actually 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, that we started taking more singles. And when we were competing, the ones who had been with me for a period of time before that, one of the things that a lot of them said was, this is the most fun I've had competing because I wasn't anxious or nervous. So their learned response to having that fear of competing or the heavier weights went away, and they were able to enjoy the process a lot more. And that's really important. That's teaching them how to cope with it. And if that's your learned behavior of when there's fear and frustration, you almost don't even recognize it. But you do want to be putting yourselves in positions that kind of make you a little bit nervous at times. Right? I think 5-pound PRs at competitions, third attempts in general, judges watching. I think the environment itself at a competition does that. But we need to do that in training. And I do think putting lifters in weird positions. And I'm not saying positions that are going to get them hurt, but doing a safety squat bar, box squat, plus a certain amount of bands or something, they're awkward movements, and they're movements we don't do all of the time. So you might do them for 3 or 4 weeks, and then you don't do them again for 6 months. So you never really develop high level skills. So it's always making you pay attention. And remember what I said, right? Norepinephrine's responsible for attention and focus. So if I'm putting them in positions that they're not always super familiar with, that they can kind of just block out and just do without thinking much, I'm not really setting up that environment and really making them step outside of their comfort zone. But if I set up that environment in a way that really makes them pay attention to the variation that we're doing, again, pay attention to the variation and to focus on what they're doing so that they can complete the task, I'm literally forcing them into this neurochemical situation, right, where they can learn and develop high levels of skill. And so when this is done well, what you see improvements in technique, and you see improvements in force production. So it's our ability to develop that skill. Because I think what people don't understand is skill acquisition does include the ability to produce force. I think that's something that's often lost, and people just want to shy away from the skill acquisition stuff because they think it's just technique, and it's really not. There's a lot more to it. If I'm reaching for this marker, my body kind of predicts how much force I need to get to it. I'm not throwing a punch or doing something that's a lot more aggressive. I understand the forces at play in order for me to navigate my environment. And again, as a coach, you're setting up that environment to teach them how to produce more force. That's kind of what we're doing, right? So performance are those short-term gains. Learning is the long-term gains. So set up that training environment in a way that the lifter can perform in that ends up teaching them how to develop high-level skill over time, so we get more stable force production, right? So like, let's say my best squat's 500 pounds. I should be able to hit that in a number of different variations, right? I should be able to do that to a box squat. I should be able to do that. If I had bands and chains and stuff like that, there should be 500 pounds of force going into it. What I should see is, because we're decreasing the amount of load at the bottom position, I should be able to produce more force at the top. So I should be able to overload those lifts. So my best deadlift's 615 pounds, but with bands and stuff, I can very often lock out 700 pounds. So I'm driving 700 pounds of force into that bar because I'm able to go a little bit faster, right? Mass times acceleration. So the mass is lower, my acceleration's more at the bottom. So with that speed, I can keep pushing that force into the bar. And at the top, there's 700 pounds of force. But, I think when you start viewing it as a coach, when you view this stuff, I think what we do a lot of times is, coaches will look at their Excel spreadsheets and it's all about volumes, intensities, frequencies, but we very rarely are thinking about the human being and what we're actually trying to accomplish, right? So like, neuroscience itself has just been wrong so frequently in the past, and there's so many different theories out there, and a lot of experts disagree with each other, but it's the next addition that needs to be put onto the physiological scientific pieces that we kind of learned, that the Russians, when they were putting out their stuff, like there was a golden age of sports science in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But now that neuroscience is starting to develop a better understanding of high-level performance, and we've been researching high-level performance since the 1990s. So you've got about 30 years of research on these high-level performers. And one of the things that we're starting to learn is that fight or flight response isn't something that we all know we need to be put under stress in training to get better. And I think most coaches will argue that, yeah, training has to have some consequences. Like, it's got to make you pay attention in some way, shape, or form. But I think many of the programs that are out there, in fact, almost all of them, I think, fail to do that with the people that they're, with the lifters that they're coaching. I think in a lot of times, if you're just doing comp lifts at given intensities, it just kind of becomes this habitual thing. And I will say there's one positive of RPE is it makes the lifter pay attention to how hard the lift is. And I think that can work to the lifter's benefit. But then again, we don't have stable loads, and it brings, I think, a lot of other variables into play, like if the lifter had caffeine before, if the type of music that's playing. So then the load becomes so variable based off of the psychological arousal that we really just don't get the same stable progress that we do of just using loads a little bit differently. But many coaches use RPEs very successfully, and this is not a bashing of it, it's more of just how I like to view my training process with the loads I'm trying to put on the bar. Like, I think, and it gets back to that performance versus learning piece, right? So if performance are just those short-term pieces that we see, and learning's that long-term changed behavior. So if they have more caffeine, they are with friends, they're blasting heavy music, we'll see an increase in their performance, right? But then the next day they come in and their boss yelled at them, they sat in traffic, they're a little tired from the day before, so then we see a drop in performance, right? And then they come in, and kind of what they're learning, I think in this situation, long-term behavioral changes, is they're learning that performance is going to drop when they don't feel good, and when they do feel good, they're going to push the weights, and I'm not sure how much stable progress you get with that over the longer term. So, don't get me wrong, you have to make day-to-day adjustments, but at the same time, like, I think a stable performance environment in order for the lifter to make those long-term learning changes is really important. And by stable training environment, we vary a lot of things within that stable training environment. So there's a lot of moving pieces here. but I do think there has to be some stability to the performance environment for long-term behavioral change to happen, because that constant repetition is needed. And I do think that the load that's on the bar matters for that stuff. But again, we take heavy singles, right? And they're going to have days they come in where they feel like shit and their performance is going to drop. But for us, it's learning to give those tools, right? So let's say I'm coming into the gym, I'm doing my best box squat max efforts, 500 pounds, and I'm up to 455 and I'm grinding it out, right? Maybe I stop there and then I really push my good mornings next, right? I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna go hit a PR here. So like we can still change that performance environment to get those small wins, to get that dopamine blast, which is that reward neurotransmitter. It gives us this this rush of feeling good, so that it's motivation basically in a neurochemical backdrop. So we get that little rush of dopamine and we want to keep doing it, and it actually still sets up that learning environment very well. So it's learning how to manipulate those environments and understand the neurochemistry behind that environment and what we literally want in that training process. And I think explaining this to the lifters is very important, because I think a lot of lifters will shy away from heavy singles because they get scared of the heavy singles. They're like, oh no, I'll just do fine in a meet. And when you're really not putting yourself outside of your comfort zone and dealing with that, the psychological pieces, the actual neurochemistry, you're not putting yourself in that environment, right? Like your neurochemical environment is an initial condition. And in complex systems, a very small change in initial conditions can have very large effects on outcomes. So we do need to make sure that we're setting this up in a way that's going to be very relevant to our competitions. But what this norepinephrine does, again, I want to reiterate, it increases alertness, our arousal, our reaction time, our attention and focus. These are all really important for us to perform at a high level. And we can use this to our advantage. And under those conditions, when training gets a little more difficult and we get a little scared and frustrated, if we lean into it and we use that to our advantage, we're going to have greater performance. So we can use fear and frustration to literally improve our performance. It's like a drug. People will always want to take like the newest supplement, the newest pre-workout so that they get that increased performance. Just put yourself in this position and learn how to use your body's neurochemistry to your advantage. It's better than any pre-workout. If we do that, norepinephrine sets off acetylcholine, which then turns on these motor neurons and remembers it. And then when we sleep and we repeat this over and over again, eventually what we do is we develop high-level skill. That myelin continues to wrap itself around those motor neurons, that acetylcholine is turning on, and what we're getting, the force production, the technique, and if we're improving, right, let's say our knees are now staying out in the squat, and we added 10 pounds to our squat, and we continue to do that, now those upper motor neurons can pass that down to the lower motor neurons, and all of a sudden, let's say, 500 pounds on a squat doesn't elicit this response anymore. It's an automatized movement. A 500-pound squat, we just stabilized into our automatized movements within the body. And then the next is to create this environment again with 505 pounds, and then do the same thing over and pass that down. So the increase in a force production over time is literally a learned skill. And we have to keep putting ourselves in positions that push us outside of our comfort zone so that we get this fear and frustration response to really set that backdrop for high-level performance. Now, a lot of people are going to have a really hard time leaning in when they get scared, unless they've developed these skills over time. From playing other sports, maybe there's a genetic piece to it. Maybe they did other things, like playing an instrument might do it, having a high-stress job, high competitive job, like maybe they public speak, they're doing that a lot, and they're able to kind of really lean into that fear and frustration. But a lot of people will really struggle with this, and this is where average gets separated from above average. Those who can't handle the fear and frustration, who don't learn how to cope and learn how to lean in and use their neurochemistry to their advantage, are going to end up being average, because at some point your progress is going to stop. And I think what you see a lot of times is this is why people just don't stick with this sport long term, is because they stop getting better, and it's very uncomfortable if you want to have above average performance. But if we're trying to develop high level skill, we need to put lifters outside their comfort zone. We need to give them the tools to handle this outside their comfort zone. And part of those tools is being educated to understand that what our body's doing is literally increased. So if you think to yourself, let's say you're going up to hit a squat PR and you're nervous, right? You can feel your heart racing, maybe your palms are a little sweaty, and you literally tell yourself, my body is putting itself in a position that if I use appropriately, I'm going to get this PR because it's increasing alertness, arousal, reaction time, attention, focus, all the things I need to hit a PR, my body's doing for me. And if I just lean in and use that, I'm gonna hit that PR more times, more often than not. And it's not about just putting it on there when like clearly your physical performance is not there. You can't just all of a sudden get scared and then hit that weight type of thing. But sometimes that happens. But if you're putting yourself, if you're doing the right things in training and at the appropriate time, you're putting that 5-pound PR on there and you're a little nervous, you will literally, if you understand, you tell yourself that my body is literally putting itself in a position to hit this weight right now, it's empowering, it really is. You know, being fearless is not the absence of fear. It's understanding that fear is not there to stop us from doing things. That fear is a natural neurochemical response to allow us to survive, to allow us to fight or flight. And when it's time to perform, we can use that to our advantage. It's to make us pay attention. It's to get our attention so that we focus, we're alert, and we're ready to perform. So I highly suggest that people train in this type of environment because it's necessary for high-level skill, but also to learn how to develop the tools to be able to lean in. So if you know you get nervous or you're easily frustrated, you throw a temper tantrum afterwards, one of the things that you really need to work on, probably the most important thing to work on, is developing a tool set in order to handle that environment. I'll continue these talks as we move forward with some of the stuff, and maybe I'll like even identify more neurotransmitters and explain how they work and how everything comes together, because I know a lot of people know what flow is and they've heard that before, being in the zone. That's a consequence of doing everything right, of your body learning how to deal with its neurochemical environment. And when all those stars align, that's when you experience flow. You can't force it. And I think in a lot of cases, that's what people try to do. They try to force that like being in the zone or that flow. And that's where, you know, pre-workout comes in, people need the right song and all of those things, when really all you need is a training environment for you to practice your performance under those conditions, right? Put a weight on the bar that challenges yourself. So if you know, and you see this a lot, where somebody will take it and they'll be like, oh no, that's good, I'm just gonna move on from there for that max effort lift. If you just take 5 pounds more, right? If you're like, you know what, I'm 100% confident I can hit 500 pounds, but 505 pounds makes me a little nervous, put that 505 on there sometimes. And understand that like, if you miss it, it's not a big deal. It kind of gives you a lot of information at the same time. Hey, did I miss it because I didn't lean into the fear? Was I scared? And then, what you do after, don't miss all the time. And, of course, there's a time and a place to really get stressed out. Like some people, if you have a really stressful job, you're not sleeping well, there's not a lot of self-care there, that increased psychological stress in training can literally be debilitating. So you need to have the right amount of it also. So like when you look at the Bulgarians, they suffered a high level of burnout. And in a lot of the research studies, when there's a lot of like higher intense training, burnout is a big byproduct of it. And that's something that we do need to pay attention to. So we need the right amount of psychological stress, and we don't want to push it too much. So it's stepping outside of your comfort zone, finding small wins and stacking those small wins over time. That's what we need to do to get better. So don't just always try to, turn yourself into a lunatic in the gym, by putting too much weight in the bar, by pushing the reps and all of that stuff. There is some negative consequences to that as well. And this is where having a coach who understands this stuff, guiding that process, is extremely important. But for now, you can follow me on Instagram. It's KWCAN, our team, Precision Powerlifting Systems.